Good evening, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays! You know, it only feels like yesterday that we were struggling to get last year's holiday special done on time, and yet here we are a year later, struggling to get this year's holiday special done on time. But in truth, a lot has changed since last year. Firstly, a lot more of you have joined us, and secondly, we've done and seen a lot of new things, and we'd like to think that our quality has improved by, well, at least just a little bit. And in the spirit of that, we'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, and get ready to enjoy a very Grim and Grin Christmas 2016. So with that introduction out of the way, I believe it's time to get started. We're going to cut to Grim, who I believe is ready to bring us his first segment. Hey Grim, what have you got for us?
Hello Grin, I'm coming to you live from just outside the Sydney Opera House, which is arguably the best location for holiday cheer.
Well, firstly, I believe geographically speaking you are in fact mistaken, and secondly, I'd just like to ask, what exactly does fat people yodeling have to do with Christmas?
What? You don't think Santa Claus sings in the shower?
Touché, Grim, touché. But I do believe it is time for you to bring us the Christmas special of SciFi MineShaft.
I don't think so, Grin. If it were the case, the title screen would... Oh, let's get started. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians is a lot like the son I never wanted. That is to say that despite its boundless potential, it does nothing but find new and inventive ways to disappoint me. And I think, in truth, that is what is most disappointing about this film, its completely squandered potential. And to name this one particular element as the film's biggest letdown is actually saying a lot, because in actuality, as far as disappointment goes, this film is not exactly in short supply. Firstly though, let's address exactly what potential the film had, because without potential, it can't exactly squander it. And as I go to do so, I'm going to endeavour to use the word potential less, because I now feel like I've said it so many times that it's starting to lose meaning. So what possibly could this film have offered if it didn't turn out to be a terrible movie? Well, it's all really in the title, isn't it? Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. That contains three things that are all completely awesome. It has Santa Claus, awesome, conquering, awesome, and Martians, awesome. When I first read the title, I was kind of hoping for a Santa's sleigh kind of Santa laying an Alexander the Great style beatdown on Marvin the Martian. Instead, rather unfortunately, I got this.
Well, we've never disappointed the kids yet.
Despite the promises of the title, this film, Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, actually has very little, if any, Santa Claus conquering Martians. The storyline, to very vaguely and quickly outline it so I can get to the point, is that the kids on Mars are acting weird, and that the reason that they're acting weird is because it's around Christmas time, and therefore the space wizard, who looks like the wizard from Monty Python, claims that the only way to make the kids from Mars not act weird is to get a Santa Claus for Mars for the Martian kids. So far, a completely reasonable and perfectly acceptable storyline for a great movie to be propped up on. The Martians then go to Earth to kidnap Santa Claus to bring Santa Claus back to give to the Martian children, and therefore save the Martian children from acting weird because they will have a Santa Claus and thus the problem would be solved. And they do in fact, to a degree, succeed in this plan and manage to kidnap Santa Claus and bring him back to Mars. However, this is where the storyline starts to get a little bit confusing because they really fail to actually emphasize what they're doing at this point. I mean, the storyline is obviously utter garbage, and there are a lot of terrible problems between the start of the movie and here that I'll get to later, but once again we'll cycle back to that later. At the moment we're still talking about that P word. So a major issue, and perhaps the biggest issue with the film, is that Santa Claus does kind of conquer the Martians, but it's done so subtly and badly that you can hardly notice him doing it, and if you do in fact notice it, it's still not done interestingly. You see, what they seem to have been attempting to get across is that Santa Claus, through his good nature or jolly vibe or some kind of intangible Christmas spirit, manages to impress on the Martians the Christmas values of goodwill to all men on peace on earth and all that jazz, and in doing so, thereby conquers them. This is, at least I think, what the writers, if I am to use the word so loosely, were attempting to do when creating this movie. However, it really does fall flat for various reasons. Firstly, the ignorance of Santa. He does not even appear to realize that he's been kidnapped, even though he was taken from his home by gunpoint after all of his elves and his wife were immobilized by the Martians and left to stand there and presumably starve to death.
But Santa Claus, you will never return to Earth.
Oui.
Now you belong to Mars.
Ho, ho, ho.
I assume they made Santa so stupid because they were attempting to show him to have some sort of childlike innocence. However, considering he's a grown man, and also considering that in another situation where he really should know what's happening, but doesn't, and the children with him do, instead of it coming across as Santa being super trusting and embodying whimsical childhood ignorance, innocence, he instead just appears to be a bit of a moron. And because the writers opted to have Santa Claus having literally no idea about anything going on around him, when his aura or intangible Christmas spirit or whatever actually begins to change the Martians, it's very difficult for the audience to actually attribute this victory to Santa Claus because he doesn't actually do anything. It just happens because he's Santa. And the second issue of Santa conquering the Martians is the Martians themselves, who don't really actually undergo any significant change. Granted, they laugh like maniacs like Santa does, but aside from that, they have actually no character development. As far as I can tell, this issue exists because the writers don't actually understand how to write conflict. You see, even before Santa Claus and the Martians encounter each other, there's already a distinct good Martian and bad Martian within the group of Martians who are all supposed to be bad. By the end of the movie, the bad Martian has been defeated, granted, but he's still evil. And also, by the end of the movie, the good Martian is supposedly acting good and it seems to have been conquered by Santa's good spirit, but despite this, the movie has already been painting him as a good guy by contrasting him with the bad Martian the entire movie, so he's still not really changed at all. And this continues to fall flat when you consider that this good Martian was actually the one who was responsible for kidnapping Santa, and even at the end of the movie only released Santa Claus because Mars actually ended up with a Santa of its own. So he's not actually undergone any moral journey, he's just gotten what he wants. So let's do a quick recap. Bad Martian still bad, supposedly good Martian who's actually responsible for the kidnapping of Santa Claus and 2 children, we'll get to that later, still actually evil, and in the end, entirely through only passive engagement, all Santa Claus has actually done is make them laugh like maniacs. Would I call that conquering? No, not really. And that's really what I mean by the film having squandered potential. If the Martians, and I mean all of the Martians, were portrayed throughout the entire film as bad, and then throughout the movie, Santa Claus, through strength of character or acts of kindness or some Christmassy thing, managed to make them see the error of their ways and thereby turn around the situation, this could have actually been a relatively decent Christmas film. Instead it didn't, wasn't, and so therefore sucked. However, quite unfortunately, this is not where the errors of the film end. The second major issue is Droppo. My god, is Droppo awful. Droppo is, I can only assume, supposed to have been the comic relief. However, he's not funny. He's basically this film's Jar Jar Binks, and nobody wants to be any film's Jar Jar Binks. Not unlike Santa Claus, Droppo is a complete and utter moron, which once again I think was supposed to be showing that he had childhood innocence. Throughout the entire film, he acts like an infuriating idiot and does things that no one with even a fraction of a functioning brain would, unless the character only existed to progress the plot when the writers had no idea what they were doing, which was basically the entire movie because these writers were clearly not very good at their jobs. And at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, he becomes the new Santa Claus, which of course he does because he's basically the exact same character as Santa Claus in the film. So he too, just like every single character in the movie, had absolutely no character progression. If this movie was anything even remotely close to competent, Droppo would not have existed as a character because he's pointless, and instead the baddest of the bad Martian could have undergone some character development when seeing the error of his ways and become Mars's Santa Claus, sort of like a Martian Grinch. Yet more squandered potential. But I suppose this could have never actually happened because it would have required the writers to have even a fraction of competence. Now, there are many more things I could complain about regarding this movie, but I've only got a short 10-minute segment in this overall holiday special, so I'll just quickly rattle off some and then do my final complaint. So, acting, garbage. Dialogue, garbage. Plot and story, utter garbage. Costumes, effects, and sets, well, to be completely honest, I really quite enjoyed those. And finally, excruciatingly poor childhood actors as the main characters, unforgivable garbage. I know I've complained about child actors several times before, for instance in Space Raiders, but considering it's Christmas time and Home Alone is one of the best Christmas movies out there which centers entirely around a child actor, and considering that children are kind of a big part of Christmas, I thought I would give this movie a pass and give it a shot despite the fact it's got child actors as its main characters. This was a mistake. Their already poor dialogue is of course delivered poorly because they're kids, and the only reason they appear in this film is to appeal to the younger generation, which is, I suppose at this point ironic, because the generation that would have grown up watching this movie are now old enough to truly despise the trope of sticking in children in a film just to make it appeal more to children. And that can literally be the only reason they were stuck in here, because their being in this film is actually a plot hole. You see, the Martians don't know where to find Santa Claus, and because they're idiots, they ask children for directions. After doing so, they realize that if they leave the children would be able to tell people that it was the Martians that took Santa Claus, and thereby Mars would be forced to face Earth's retribution, whatever that may be. And so they decide to avoid the issue by kidnapping the children. Speaking of retribution, it should also be noted that the act of kidnapping the children receives at no point during the film any serious moral questioning, and at the end of the movie, the Martians themselves receive no retribution for doing so. But whatever, speaking from a merely tactical point of view, it does make sense to remove the only evidence that ties you to the crime. However, only moments later the sense ends. The Martians burst into Santa's workshop, are instantly recognized as Martians by one of Santa's helpers, stun everyone, take Santa and leave. And then obviously later on these elves thaw because it's instantly reported that the Martians stole Santa. We know that the Martians know that their guns would only stun for a while because they tell us, and we also know that the Martians quickly become aware that the humans know they stole Santa because we're told that too. So why kidnap the children to keep the fact you're stealing Santa a secret if you're just going to leave the helpers there? And furthermore, once the cat's out of the bag, why not return the children? And really, there is actually quite a logical answer to that question. That answer being that Santa Claus Conquers the Martians is a terribly written film with bad plot holes, terrible acting, and thoroughly squandered potential.
So there you have it. Santa Claus Conquers the Martians. Arguably the film equivalent of a stocking full of coal. As always, I try to imagine who I would suggest this film for, and I suppose if you're like me and you have a morbid curiosity for bad movies and you love Christmas, give it a crack, but don't expect it to be any good. That's the end for me in this segment. We're back to you in the studio, Grin. Well, thanks, Grim. That was of an acceptable level of quality. But before we do move on, I'd first like to ask, is that a different hat than the one you were wearing at the start of your segment? Yes, it is a different hat. This one does this. Well, okay, let's move on and hopefully raise the bar of quality a little bit because it's time for my segment.
Stay Frosty 2, the Atari 2600 sequel to Stay Frosty 1. Now, while I've not actually played Stay Frosty 1, I can only assume that at the end of the game you do manage to successfully stay frosty, because if you didn't, there simply would not be room for a sequel. Although you would not imagine that Frosty's had that much experience with staying frosty when looking at the game's cartridge cover, which has a depiction of what I assume to be Frosty the Snowman sitting in front of a roaring fire. And while looking at the cartridge now, I only just noticed that the entire title is actually Stay Frosty 2 Stay Frostier, which is even better than just Stay Frosty 2. The artwork on the cartridge is really just fantastic, and looks like it's been taken straight out of a Christmas greeting card. However, as soon as you boot up Stay Frosty 2, you quickly learn that beautiful artwork is not exclusive to the cover art, because this game is really gorgeous. The title screen has Frosty himself, one of the flame baddies that you later come to fight, a couple of ice cubes, a surprisingly detailed depiction of your pleasure stick, and at the top of the screen the title Stay Frosty 2 Stay Frostier, which quite amazingly looks even better in Atari graphics than it does on the cartridge. This is, as far as I've seen in Atari games, an extreme rarity. Speaking of extreme rarities, this game not only has a great range of sound effects, but also has an entire soundtrack. I'm not entirely certain exactly how many songs this soundtrack consists of, but I would say it's at least 6, which is unprecedented because most Atari 2600 games don't have one song, let alone 6 or more. Each song is appropriately Christmassy, with the playlist including but not limited to Deck the Whole, Silent Night, and God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Although, interestingly enough, as far as I could tell, the Christmas carol Frosty the Snowman, of which Frosty the Snowman originates, does not actually appear to be on the playlist. But as far as I'm aware, that song is not actually in the public domain, so that would probably be the reason why. Moving on from the fantastic soundtrack, the gameplay of the game is also equally fantastic. You can make Frosty go left and right using your pleasure stick, and make him jump using your big red button. Aside from Frosty's inability to climb ladders, it kind of works a lot like Donkey Kong. However, unlike Donkey Kong in Stay Frosty 2 Stay Frostier, your objective is not just to get to the top, but instead to kill all of the enemies on the screen, which will make a flashing arrow appear, and if you go into said arrow, it'll take you to the next level. Although I suppose in Donkey Kong's defense, in the second level you're actually having to jump over those platforms, which is not just getting to the top. But still, it's a very different game, it just has slightly similar controls. But I digress. By using your pleasure stick and utilizing your red button, you can move Frosty around the screen, allowing him to collect items and kill enemies. These enemies come in the form of sentient flames, which, despite Frosty's apathy towards them on the game cartridge, can actually damage and or kill Frosty. The game mechanic used to defeat these enemies is actually quite interesting. Frosty the Snowman must be positioned over the enemy, and so using his own frozen flesh douses the flame. In doing so, Frosty will melt slightly, and if he melts too much, he will die and you will lose a life. Therefore, it seems that in Stay Frosty 2 Stay Frostier, the only way to defeat evil in the world is self-sacrifice, and Frosty is quite literally sacrificing himself for our salvation. In this case, Frosty takes up the mantle of a messiah-type figure, which is perhaps very suiting for the Christmas season. However, unlike the great late Jesus H. Christ, Frosty the Snowman can replenish his health by picking up ice cubes. Just as moving over top of the flame bad guys diminishes Frosty's health, moving over top of the ice cubes replenishes it. However, ice cubes are not the only item and or power-up available to Frosty. A quick look at the attractively decorated manual tells us that there are 7 items available, including the broom, the corncob pipe, the snowflake, the branch, the carrot, the ice chest, and the coal. All of these items have individual effects on Frosty, with the broom allowing you to double jump, meaning that clicking the red button a second time will make him jump a second time, the corncob pipe, which makes Frosty practically invulnerable for a certain amount of time, the snowflake, which places back all the ice cubes on the screen that you've already removed, the branch that moves walls, which I'll get to a bit later, the carrot, which allows you to throw things, which I'll also get to a bit later, the ice chest, which unlike the ice cube restores all, not just some of Frosty's health, and the coal, which reveals invisible platforms, which I'll also get to in a bit later. It is, however, interesting that the manual does not mention the ice cubes as an item, considering that they perform basically the same function, albeit diminished as the ice chest, and that the snowflake refers to it, and especially that they're literally the most common item in the game. It is quite bizarre that they left it out. The manual also lists a second group of other elements that can help or hinder your mission, which they've labeled other elements that can help or hinder your mission. However, this group, just like the previous one, fails to mention the ice cubes. This group includes the fireball enemies that I spoke of earlier, presents, lava platforms, walls, elevators, fire birds, which by the way have the coolest in-game art I've seen in any Atari 2600 game so far, and the gas canisters. It is in no small part due to this large array of items that I actually enjoyed Stay Frosty 2 far more than I enjoyed Donkey Kong. You see, in Donkey Kong, the entire game really entirely depends on your reflexes, with how well you do depending on how well you can jump over cookies that roll at an increasingly fast speed, and magic lamps that behave increasingly erratically. However, over in Stay Frosty 2, while reflexes are still part of the game, they are exactly that. They are only part of the game, and really there's a much larger emphasis on problem solving. These problems that you have to solve mostly arise from the fact that Frosty melts, and that you have to melt Frosty in order to kill the enemies to pass the levels. Because there's also a finite number of ice cubes on the screen that can heal Frosty, this means that you're constantly weighing up your odds. Should you pick up the ice cube now and then kill the enemy, or should you kill those enemies now and pick up those ice cubes? Increasing this difficulty, there are some areas that you can simply not avoid taking damage in, and also some areas you can't even get to without having taken damage. There are some enemies you can't reach, and so can only take them down by throwing globs of your own icy flesh at them after picking up the carrot up, and there are some enemies you can't get to without picking up the branch which moves the walls out of the way. Increasing this difficulty even further, as time goes on, Frosty will melt, and also you'll find yourself faced by the Firebirds, which steal your carrot upgrades, which can be a total pain in your frosted buttocks, and they're also undefeatable, so you best just avoid them. As the levels go on, you'll find yourself increasingly coming across more enemies with less ice cube, and you essentially get to a point where every single ice cube matters. Adding to the mystery and intrigue of the game, if you perform certain tasks, you can also unlock secret levels. So far, I've only discovered one, and it was by complete accident, but I would be less than surprised if there are plenty more. Speaking of levels, Stay Frosty 2, unlike Donkey Kong, does not have 2 levels that repeats, but instead has, well, a lot of them. And at this point, in the interest of full disclosure, I have to admit that we actually had to bend the rules here for this one. You see, here at Channel Grim and Grin, we've got a policy of only reviewing games we've actually finished, and well, I've not actually finished Stay Frosty 2, so you really shouldn't consider this to be a full review, but instead only part of a review, because since I've not finished the game, I can only review part of it. After putting in a fairly long time playing the game, I managed to get up to level 22, and I convinced myself that surely this must be close to the end of the game because I had been playing it for so long and trying so very hard. So I decided to look up in the manual to see if it gave any indication of how close I was to the end, expecting there to be a couple more levels. But it turns out that Stay Frosty 2 in fact has 32 distinct levels, which sort of blows Donkey Kong's 2 out of the water. Furthermore, these 32 levels repeat 4 times, getting more difficult each time you pass the 32 levels, which comes to a grand total of 128 levels. This means that despite my season-long effort of playing the game, getting me up to level 22 means I was not even halfway through the game. Despite this knowledge, Grim and I decided that I should do this review anyway, because it's better than not having any Christmas special for Grin reviews. What this means for me is that Stay Frosty 2 is the gift that keeps on giving, because next Christmas season I'm going to be able to just bust out Stay Frosty 2 and try to get further than I did. And what this means for you is that you really should take this review with a grain of salt, because essentially since I did not even get through half the game, it's sort of like watching a review of a movie from someone who only watched the first part of the movie. So despite me admittedly lacking the knowledge required to give a full review of this game, what can I tell you that I haven't told you so far? Well, firstly, the mere experience of having so much trouble passing the game can tell you that it's very difficult. The game also only gives you 4 lives and 2 continues, which means aside from bonus lives, which are far and few between, appearing every 20,000 points, you only have 12 lives in total to complete the entire 128 levels. Is this unfairly difficult? No, but it's definitely challenging, and because it is so challenging, whenever you do manage to unlock a new level, it does give you a great sense of achievement, and I'm definitely looking forward to slapping the game in next Christmas and having another crack at it. So there you have it, Stay Frosty 2, Stay Frostier. Easily one of the most challenging and beautiful games on the Atari 2600, and definitely the one with the biggest soundtrack. So if you're looking for a fantastic Christmas-themed game to play this holiday season, head down to your local video store and pick up a copy of Stay Frosty 2, Stay Frostier for the Atari 2600.
Thanks, me, that was truly brilliant, although you may have trouble finding a video store open on Christmas Eve. And with that, our Christmas special is coming to an end. But before it does, we'd first like to thank everyone that subscribed to our channel, liked or commented on any of our content, or watched any of our videos. We appreciate it immensely. And so we here at Channel Grim and Grin would like to say Merry Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. Now, if you don't mind, I'm off to have another crack at Stay Frosty 2.